chat box or message them to the entire chat group. I'm not going to always be able to see them when I start presenting, but we're going to try to set some time at the end of the day to answer some of the questions that you may have regarding this topic. So welcome to the third part of our four-part series, Fruit on Fridays with Grapes. My name is Grant McCarty. I'm a local fruits and small farms educator that serves through Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. I know that many of you all have been a part of the entire series, but we're also happy to have new participants with us today on this topic. Grapes is one of those questions that we get a lot of questions about at our extension office. And it's one that can work for you depending on how that season goes. But I think what you're going to find today is that there's a lot of decisions that you have to make when it comes to grape production. I'm going to turn my camera on briefly so you can just kind of see who your presenter is. I'll turn my camera on back on at the end today to answer those questions that you have. So you did get an email with the handouts, and you also got a couple of additional references in there for today's presentation. I was editing a couple of things this morning after I sent that to you, so you may see some changes, and I will try to mention where some of those changes are. It's not dramatic changes, it's just kind of playing around with some of the wording and trying to make more sense of some of the things we're talking about today is what I try to do. So today's plan is just grapes. And you think to yourself, gosh, can you fill 90 minutes worth of information just on grapes? And in fact, you can. That was what I really found when I was developing today's presentation and working on finding resources, was we could spend multiple hours going into grape production and some of the things you have to consider. So consider today as very much an introduction class into getting started in grape production, as well as hopefully addressing some of those things that you may have already encountered if you have been growing grapes for some time. So today will be a general overview. What are some things you have to consider when it comes to growing grapes? What are some potential opportunities in grape culture and grape production? We'll get into cultivars, some of the decisions that you have to make when it comes to selecting the right grapes for your growing area. And a good portion of today is going to be on training, trellising, and pruning your grapes. I think what you're going to find with growing this particular fruit is that to be successful in growing it, you have to get all pieces, the training, the trellising, and the pruning in place in order to have good success. The other section that we'll spend a lot of time on is disease management. While this does say insect management, most of today is going to be about disease management, because in where we live in this Midwestern climate, this planting zone 5B, diseases wreak havoc on grapes. And I want to share with you images of what some of these diseases look like and some of the things that you need to be aware of when managing them and controlling them with it. We'll touch briefly on bird and wildlife management, and we'll also touch a bit on harvest. But primarily today is going to be this training, trellising, and disease management thing to get you on the right path, or to maybe direct you and get you on a newer path if you need be. The last couple of times I presented Fruits on Friday, I tend to feel like I talk about the challenges with a certain fruit. So I've decided to flip the script and let's just talk about the opportunities here. With grapes, there's some good opportunities. There's a lot of unique and interesting Midwestern varieties that have been developed for decades in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and these are coming through the universities up there. These are also being developed from kind of private grape breeders. So there's some really interesting and fascinating ones available to you to grow that thrive in our very, very cold winters. Now, they may not be the ones that you fully maybe expect to grow. However, there's some uniqueness here that may make you become a grape enthusiast for certain varieties. You may find this is a very rewarding fruit tree to grow, or fruit rather to grow, thinking about how the grapevines look and taking pride in how you are trellising and pruning and training them and harvesting them. You may find that this is something that is a great hobby for you that maybe eventually evolves into a business perhaps. So you may find a good potential here. One of the things to mention is that, especially in grapes, they have very low water and fertility requirements. As you think about maybe where you might plant grapes, these would do fine in an area that maybe stays really dry. In fact, that might be an area that we suggest you plant your grapes. Many cases, they also don't have as much, say, fertility needs that they might need compared to some of the other fruits that you might grow. As you think about, this kind of introduction to grapes, or if you've grown grapes for a couple of years, you might have considered this as a potential hobby that grows into a business. Perhaps you find that this is something that, as you explore more about the opportunities in grapes, you realize that there are vineyards nearby that might be interested in purchasing grapes from you, or you may decide to, hey, maybe there's a dream down the road to actually begin your own vineyard and grow grapes for that vineyard. So potentially a hobby and potentially an opportunity. One of the other things that's always mentioned with grapes is that they really preserve your soil in your growing area. You see it in this photo, especially when it comes to setting up a vineyard or a small growing area, you're really just going to be turning the soil right where those grapes are. And in between rows, we typically are preserving that in cover crops or in very low growing grasses that you see here. And as you think about preserving the soil or preserving areas for those native pollinators and others, this could be a fine thing as you just have one strip that you really are planting them. Another thing to consider is you just need one plant. We're not talking about that you need multiple plants all flowering at the same time. As we discuss, say, some of our fruit trees, this is one where if you've got space for it and you just want to put out one great plant, you can get away with it. Now let's talk about those challenges then. With any fruit and sometimes with any vegetable that you're going to grow in our area, there's always going to be some challenges. Grapes have heavily destructive diseases every single year. It is these are heavily destructive, they're hard to manage. This is not a crop that is going to be easy to grow and expect to not be doing any sort of spraying. The grape diseases that you'll see today will hit the leaves, they will hit the fruit, they will sometimes hit other parts of that grape, and it can mean a complete crop failure that begins early in the spring and is all the way through in harvest. So this is not one fruit that escapes it. There is also an expectation of fungicide use, especially if you are considering maybe selling these to a vineyard or consider even maybe wanting to use them in the home for your own purposes. You may find that you need to be more aware of fungicidal use and how to control diseases, and yet again, may not fully control them. So just expect that these are going to have some issues. We also find limited cultivars. Maybe you have traveled to other parts of the United States and encountered different grape varieties there. You're going to really find that those varieties that grow well for them really can't always grow well in our Midwestern area. So there are limited cultivars. And when I say limited cultivars, we're talking about 70 plus cultivars. So there are a lot, and yet there's not as many that you might be used to. Consider that grapes are also year-round management, especially in the summer, the spring, the winter, and the fall. You might be pruning, you might be spraying, you might be managing your crop load of grapes that you have growing. You might be trying to keep birds away from your grapes that you might have too. Consider too that grapes have a trellising pruning requirement in order to make them really thrive and live their best life, if you will. And so you really want to consider that. And both this trellising and pruning idea will be brought up more and more today, but it will also be decisions that you make early on will impact the grape for its entire life. And so, if you're deciding that this is just going to be for your backyard or for your home consumption, the first couple of years of trellising and pruning will determine that direction. When you compare that maybe to you're going to be a commercial little grape operation, that might be an entirely different decision you have to make. Bird damage is also an occurrence every single season. We'll talk about some bird netting. And the other thing to recognize is that inputs can get pretty expensive, especially as you begin to, maybe see this as a hobby that gets bigger and bigger. You may find that it gets more challenging to control for diseases and to prune and to harvest things. Certainly on a commercial scale, that's where it can get a little expensive. So you've got these handouts, and when we get into grapes, we now are talking about new terminology and new ways of actually talking about our grape plant. And you're going to hear these terms throughout today. And so I just wanted to kind of condense it all into this one image that you see here, this drawing that I made. So very much as you think about right at the base of where that soil line is, you have your grape trunk. And as you go up to that grape trunk, you're going to see a cordon perhaps. Cordon is considered a multi-year-old extension of your trunk. So think of it as that it's permanent in some ways. It lives for about 7 to 10 years. And then off of this cordon, you have spurs that develop with shoots and canes that develop from them. On the left side, you see here, we've got canes. These are mature shoots, those that become woody after growth has ceased. The shoots are immature, soft stems, growths of the current growing season. And I should clarify here, when you see the word shoot there, that is young, Y-O-U-N-G. So it is something that has just grown that summer, perhaps. To further confuse you, every year you have shoots that are developing and canes that are developing. And you are selecting canes every winter that in the previous summer were previously called shoots. We'll explain more as we go along, but note that this is going to get a little confusing. So it's also important to add more confusion here that not all plants will have cordons and spurs. So it depends on how you prune whether this cordon structure will be established, or rather every single year you're going to choose canes. But recognize that there's just a seasonal mix of canes and shoots once you get into year 3 and 4. So you have canes that are producing fruit off of them from buds. You have shoots that are growing, and then that shoot that summer then overwinters into the next winter, where we now call it a cane. Every year you just get this flush of growth. So looking at these two drawings, and we'll get back to these more and more as we go along today. Let's start on the left side. So if you already have an established grapevine, you may have a cordon already established in place. And the cordon is very woody, it's much older, and it is basically an extension of that trunk there. And so every season, when you look at the cordon, you will have spurs on there, and the spurs will develop canes. Consider the spurs being very, very short canes, and yet they live for many, many years. That's the structure that you may have. A lot of times, though, the right photo is what we really see. We see that we have maybe a very tall trunk, and then off of that trunk, we have all of these young canes that are developing. And every single season, when it comes to our dormant pruning, I am selecting maybe 2 to 4 canes that will then be trellised against the gray wire that you see here. And then all of the other canes are removed. Once these canes have produced fruit for me that summer, they are removed. And it is those new shoots that developed that summer that have now called canes that I now am deciding. So it's a little confusing, and I hope as we go along today, you're going to continually see images that will kind of help you think more about what you want to do. If you're brand new to grape production, if you've never grown any grapes before, and maybe this is your first year of planting them, you will have kind of 2 decisions. You could plant your grape plant. You could go the cordon route with this semi-permanent structure in place, or you could go the cane route. And every year you get this flush of new canes that you are selecting. But yet again, this is just kind of serving as a bit of an introduction to this terminology. We're going to keep looking at this as we go along today when it comes to pruning trellising. I also have one of our participants from a previous class who sent in photos of what his a previous participant sent in photos of his canes and what his grapevines currently look like. So we'll look at those too, and that can maybe help you think more about this. So choosing those cultivars, one of the big decisions is table or wine. That's really what you're going to see, is that there's going to be a group of grape cultivars that's really good for table, for fresh eating. And you're going to have a group that's just better for wine. It's going to be better for making into wine. And you'll see that most of them are one or the other. You may find some cultivars of both. You may find that they're like, well, you could use it as fresh eating. You could also maybe use it for wine if you so chose. But really, that's going to be one major decision you have to make. Consider too your end use and your long-term goals. Perhaps it's just you like fresh grapes, you like making them into jams, you just like eating them off the vine. That might be your table. Compared to if it's like, well, I'm staying at home a lot more regularly. Maybe I wanted to start making my own wine, and maybe you decide on wine grapes. Consider disease resistance, winter hardiness, less vigor, and early yielding. Those are all really good factors that will come into place when it comes to choosing cultivars. The reason for maybe early yielding is that if they're harvested early, that means there are weeks where maybe you're not having to spray as much, or they're able to avoid some of that very hard diseases that they might be getting hit with. Always order from a reputable nursery or greenhouses. You're going to find many options. You're going to find that there's a lot more out there than maybe what I've really shared with you today so far. In thinking about this kind of group, you've got the trellising and training. Most of these are going to work fine on an arbor, whether it's a grape for wine production or it is a table grape. They should work pretty well on any kind of arbor system or other maybe strange structure that you might be using. You're also going to space these about 6 to 8 feet between plants, and then fully expect maybe about 10 to 12 pounds of fruit per plant each year. Sometimes it goes up to 20 pounds of fruit per plant. It depends on that season. Fully expect maturity about into year 3 and 4, but also recognize that they may live for up to 30 years. So they can live for a pretty long period of time, much more than maybe some of our other fruits. Could you do a mixture of table and wine grapes in a row? So say you've had space for only 3 grapes and you're thinking that, well, I'd like one for table, I'd like one for a wine grape, maybe my final one is a wine grape. You might be able to get away with that. The only thing to recognize is that each of these is going to have different disease resistance, and each of them may have different disease vulnerabilities. You may also encounter that some of them are early maturing compared to those that are late maturing. So that would be the only caution here, is that if it's a single row of them and you just have space for 3 plants, you want to consider what that resistance is, or else it's going to be, 8 feet worth of a diseased grape, and then maybe another grouping of them on that single row that disease is not a problem. So with wine grapes in this group, consider its end use and its potential type. Most of these are going to be either for a red or a white. You may find some that are kind of the middle of the road that could work for some of those unique blends, but certainly that will be one decision. This is the description of many of them will say this is for red type and this is for white. You're also going to find that they will mention the type of wine that this will work well for, whether it's a Sauvignon Blanc, or maybe it is a Merlot, or some of those other styles out there, which frankly, I just don't know my wine enough to really explain too much. But you will see those descriptions. A lot of times they also are giving something about the flavor or the profile notes. So they're explaining what kind of flavors that you should expect from this type of wine if the grape was grown and made into it. So that's another kind of characteristic thing that you might consider. And that may help you also decide what you're after here too, is that, okay, I want to grow a grape for red wine. It's a certain type of red wine I'm really after. And then here's the ability to kind of explain these flavor notes. You see here MN Hardy, that's Minnesota Hardy. There's a number of Minnesota Hardy grapes out there available to you. They have done a lot of great research. They've also made sure that they can really withstand some of those very planting zone areas that we're growing in. Some to mention here, some examples: Frontenac Grise. Those are 2 very common ones that we see a lot of folks grow of a wine grape. One is used for reds, the other is used for white type of wine there. The Frontenac Grise is gray in color. The Itasca is a white type, so it's very dry is what they describe the flavor notes with. It's extremely cold hardy. This is one that a lot of folks really like. They really like the flavor of it. They really like its growth pattern too. Occasionally with wine grapes, you will also see some that are mentioned for juice or jelly. So this could be an option, is that, something like King of the North, while it's a blue grape, you could also be growing it for wine, certain types of styles, but you could also grow it for your juice and your jelly. So in some ways, you could get this one type that could be used in 3 different ways. Marquette is a black. The only issue with Marquette, with this particular one, is that it's potentially very vulnerable to early frosts. So especially in our growing area, you might want to avoid this one, as we tend to have those late frosts that linger, and Marquette may be more severely damaged with that. For table grapes, consider fresh eating, but they could be used in other ways. So you may find that some of these table grapes are mentioned and listed in different ways they could be used other than just fresh eating. There are some that are seeded, of course, some that are seedless. The seeded ones tend to be a little bit more winter hardy, though there are still seedless types that exist. And there are some that are certainly mentioned for our planting zone that work fine. I think one of the drawbacks with the table grapes is that there are many that are very susceptible to diseases. A lot of the cultivar development for grapes is so focused sometimes on wine grapes, and with it focused on disease resistance, that the table grapes don't always get the attention they need to focus in on disease resistance. So that would just be one thing to be a little bit cautious of, though there are disease-resistant cultivars of table grapes too. You see a couple here listed. If you want to grow Concord, Concord is one we recommend. It's reliable. It's very adaptable to our growing area and our planting zone. Certainly, we see that it grows very well in other parts of the United States, and yet it still grows really well in our northern Illinois area. Edelweiss is a white, very moderate susceptible to disease, so has a little bit of susceptibility here. Your Somerset would be a seedless type. It would be red. It also would be early yields, which might be a good decision as you're thinking about what you might need to do for managing disease. St. Teresa is one mentioned for adaptability to different soils. It also grows really well on arbors. And then one of the other ones to mention would be Reliance. It's red, it has good storage availability. And yet again, these are just some that are out there. One of the documents that you saw in your box folder is this document. It's called A Review of Cold Climate Grape Cultivars. This is from Iowa State in 2016, and it goes through about 70 plus cultivars that would work pretty well for us in Northern Illinois. So each of these cultivars is highlighted with a lot of information in here, and yet I think there's certain things I would look at. Look at your growth. Some of these grapes have a lot of vigor to them, and they're known to produce a lot of canes and a lot of growth. And if you are thinking more critically on having to manage disease and don't want to spray some of these fungicides, you might look towards one that has a bit of a low vigor to it as well. You will also see that each of these will talk about their disease susceptibility. So you can kind of see with this Aldine one, it has a susceptibility to bunch rot and powdery mildew, which are some ones that we're concerned with. You will also find whether or not it's listed as a wine grape. You can see Aldine is not used as a wine grape pretty much here. The other thing to look at would be hardiness. As you think about where we live in planting zone 5A and 5B, and maybe others are joining on this call that it's much colder, some of these are just a hardiness down to -20, a moderate hardiness. And yet you may find that where you're at, you may want to consider having something that is very hardy and can go down much further than that, depending on our seasons. Yet again, this document is found in that box folder I sent to you today. It would be a great place to start when it comes to choosing your cultivars and then kind of going from there. So for each of those cultivars that are listed, you're going to find some disease resistance. And in most cases, I hesitate to say that every single one has disease resistance, but you're at least going to see some explanation whether there is full resistance, whether there are vulnerabilities, whether it's very susceptible to some of them more than others. The big 4 to look at would be black rot, powdery mildew, downy mildew, and botrytis. And we'll talk about these today, but these would be the ones to look at. You may find that there is, a cultivar that has pure disease resistance to every single one of them. You may find they just have disease resistance to one or the other. I think this is especially true if you have an arbor in place and you're going to maybe have it going onto a structure that might be hard to manage disease. I would certainly look towards something that has disease resistance in thinking of what your structure is going to look like. Because, if you think about an arbor that might be going right over the top of your head and all of this great foliage is hanging from it, if it gets disease, that's going to look really rough. It's going to look really bad. And yet it's also going to be very hard to even manage it and control it. So think about your structure. Consider that from a disease resistant standpoint. Recognize too, this is just one part of disease management. This is just one thing we'll be talking about today when it comes to managing diseases on these. Some that do have resistance, you see a lot that are your wine grapes, your Frontenac, your Itasca, your Marquette. Reliance is one that does have disease resistance, and it's a table grape. The guy from Iowa State can go into more detail on some of them. Every time you order from a company and other places, they'll also mention some disease resistance too, and what your options are. So as far as location, you decide under grapes, or maybe you currently have grapes that you're growing, consider having a good full sun. These are plants that really thrive with a good full sun, as much as you can give to them. They also really need good water drainage. They do not like to stay in areas that pond or places that really flood. This is a crop that is going to thrive in kind of very dry conditions, or conditions that dry out frequently. You don't want to have them just sitting in any area that stays really wet. You might consider a medium textured soil, so a mixture kind of clay, a little bit of silt, areas that, that mixture of soil would help with drainage. A silty, sandy type of soil would also work really well here too. A slight slope, a hilltop would also be great. If you had a little bit of that, would work really well, because yet again, it might be addressing some of that drainage issue that we're trying to not have for this crop. You also want to avoid any frost pockets, which is what this drawing shows here. You see kind of a dipping down where it stays cooler, it stays more humid, it has poor drainage. This is a crop that's just not going to do well in a frost pocket, and you really want to avoid any of that. Same with clay soils, same with any kind of ponding. Most of the time, your grapes are going to start well with a 6 to 6.5 soil pH. You might be able to go a little bit higher, a little bit lower than that. They can adapt really well with it in most cases. You also want to consider having them away from any wooded areas or trees. The reason being that this could entice deer, this could entice birds. Avoiding those areas can be very helpful. While, as we think about a hilltop that might be completely exposed, could of course be exposed to deer and other wildlife. If you think about a smaller scale in a backyard setting, avoiding any of those areas where the bird would just kind of hang out nearby is really what you're after. When you order your grapevines from the company, in most cases, they're coming as a bare root. So they don't have any growth with them. They just don't have any foliage with them. Occasionally, you will sometimes see grapevines that already have some growth with them. In most cases, you're going to find that's not going to necessarily, get it to mature quicker necessarily. Because really those first 3 to 4 years of planting are focused highly on building up that root system and creating a good, strong, solid grape trunk. That's really what you're after at this first 3 years. And so while it's great that there's foliage on those grapes at planting date, you may find that it's just not going to close that gap. I think you would be fine if you just ordered kind of these bare rooted grapes. Ideally, you're going about 6 to 8 feet apart between plants. As you can imagine, if you are closer at 6 feet, that's going to mean that your canes that would be going both the right and the left from that plant are probably going to be sitting at about 3 feet. That's really what you'll be after on a seasonal basis. So 8 feet is a little bit more optimum, if you will. You want to keep vines in buckets of water as they arrive and you're going to plant that day. Dip them in water, keep them in there. You can prune the roots, going back to maybe 3 or 4 inches would be fine for this group. And then till of or kind of right where planting. There's no need to till up the entire growing area, just where you're planting would be fine for this group. This is also one, as mentioned, at this stage, a fertilizer is not recommended. As it gets more mature, you might find that you need to do a fertilizer, but at this point, we're not recommending one. So you are planting new grapes this season, this upcoming spring, for instance, they've arrived. And when you plant them into the ground, you're actually going to do a little bit of pruning on it. So you're just going to prune to about 1 shoot and about 3 buds. That's really what you're after here. And this is going to vary considerably depending on how much to prune back is going to vary based on where those buds are. So, really that first year, go down to 1 shoot at planting, and off of that shoot, you're going to have 3 buds. The first season, that first summer and into the fall, you're going to have potentially a lot of growth. A lot of these shoots are going to develop. And from there, so say we're now pruning in that first winter, you are going to prune out everything except for a single trunk. So you're trying to get trunk establishment is really what you're after here with it. So the first season, that first, say, summer of 2021, all of these canes have developed. Now I'm in the winter of 2022. I am pruning back all except one. And that one is going to start to become my trunk. You do not need any trellising at planting. You could get away with waiting for trellising until usually, I'd say probably the end of August is when you'd want to get some trellising and structure in place. That is one of the benefits with planting of grapes, especially, an area, is that you do have a couple of months there to begin to think about what your trellising structure is going to look like and what you have in place. Perhaps you found the area you're planting the grapes, you just have to build your arbor, and you have some months to do that. Focus a lot on trunk establishment that 3 and 4 years. That's really what you're after here. So you can kind of see the second year where I'm down to 1 cane. In the subsequent years, maybe that 3rd year in, I probably am still going to be pruning off everything except for the growth on the other side. It might not be until maybe 2024, perhaps, when that's where I actually begin deciding on the canes or deciding on the cordon that I'm going to have in place. So training is going to be positioning of your grape plant that's going to just allow for yields, for airflow, and good growth. This is why you train them. This is why you put a structure in place so that they can address the issues that they have and hopefully allow them to stay dry to keep disease from spreading. There's a lot of different trellising systems out there. Most of the time, your grapes can really adapt to whatever structure you have in place. It still is kind of always getting back to that principle of a grape trunk. And then from there, deciding on what you're after. Now, that's a simplistic statement because certainly if you're thinking, all right, I'm going to grow them kind of maybe on a semi-commercial basis, you do want to think more critically about that trellising system. There's a lot of common ones out there. You'll see a 4 and a 6 cane Niffen, which is what you see here in this image from Iowa State. So you see they have a central trunk, and then every winter they are selecting canes that will go on either side and go either direction. And you see that in this system, the first line is at 3 feet. The second system is at 3 feet as well. So that's their kind of cane system. You also have the bilateral cordon system, which will show you what that looks like. And that's where you have, yet again, you've created a cordon. The cordon remains permanent or semi-permanent for 7 to 10 years. And then the grapes are growing off of that. If you have arbor, if you have others, maybe train with the structure and yields in mind. So if you think of planting maybe this spring and you have maybe a arbor that is 6, 7 feet tall, perhaps for those 3 to 4 years, you're trying to train your trunk to get all the way up there. So that's where your focus is. So that then once it reaches the top of the arbor, you then could have your canes or a cordon in place that grows from it. So in this 4 cane system, you've got 4 canes that are selected, producing grapes from that center trunk. You've got 2 lines at 3 feet each. They're going both directions from it. We'll talk more in pruning about how long these canes should be, but this can be a very simple design. So new canes are selected every single year. During dormancy, you're pruning out a lot of the extra canes because they're just not needed. And this allows for a good balance of your canes in this system here too. You will sometimes see renewal spurs, and we'll talk a little bit more about that with pruning. Think of a renewal spur as a growth that you keep every year so that it can produce more cane options for you. So that renewal spur will grow with your 1-year-old canes in this summer, and then that next winter, it should have provided some additional canes that can be selected to then be trained that upcoming year. The bilateral cordon looks a little bit different though. So it's this permanent cordon both directions from the center of the trunk. And you can see here that this permanent cordon starts at about 5.5 feet. Going upward, and then potentially, you could get in 16 feet spacing 2 of your grapevines, 2 of your grape plants. When it comes to kind of getting this design in place, it's going to depend highly on those first couple of years. So, as you look at your structure, you may find that at a certain point with the trunk, there may be some canes that develop. And so you'll want to leave them behind and kind of train them, because they will eventually get older and they will then produce your fruit for you. You can go either direction here. You can do this bilateral cordon, or you could decide to do the cane. We see bilateral cordon more common in wine grape production. That's just one of the things we really notice with it. Off of the cordon, you have the buds on the spurs that are selected from cordon to produce the fruit. That's what you really see there. So the cordon is just that permanent extension of the trunk, and then the spurs are basically short canes that live for a number of years, which will then produce the fruit for you. Either one will probably work fine for you, but just consider that it may take some time to get this cordon developed for you. When you look at something like this, so maybe like an arbor or a fan design, it can work fine for grapes. You will certainly be able to kind of get your grapevine in shape. You may find that if you have planted your grape this springtime, you have a very long cane that develops, and that cane then could be tied higher up onto that arbor, knowing full well that that's going to be your trunk, and that trunk will be much higher up on there over some time. You still have to factor in, though, yearly pruning needs. So you could find that this works well for you and you're able to kind of adapt, or you may find that a system like this really requires, a trunk going all the way up to the top. And then once it reaches the top, it's easier for you to create a cordon across. That could be something that you find that you have to do. So it can really depend, I think. I've seen some arbors where the trunks go up to about 5 feet at the top. And then from there, I have seasonal canes that will basically fall over into that arbor structure. And then every season, you're coming through and you're removing all except for a couple of canes that you need. But creating a long trunk with a cane extension is an option, or also cordon designs too. So as mentioned, trellising is not needed at planting, but it should be in place that summer. And so where should that first line be? It's going to highly depend on your structure. It's going to highly depend on the shape you're after. And it will potentially also depend on how the plant has really responded. A lot of times we do think that, okay, if I'm just going to have one grape trellis, I'm just going to do one trellis shape, I could probably get away about 5 feet. That would be where my one line would be. And up against that 5 feet, I'm going to have my plant go, the right and the left direction, or where those canes are going to be created, or the cordon is going to be created. If it's 2 lines, this might be at 36 inches, and then the next one is at 60 inches. So at 3 feet, at about 5 feet would be my lines. And in most cases, if it was 2 lines, we're probably talking about canes that would be developed off the trunk. So at 36 inches, at 60 inches would be cane designs. A cordon design where you have that permanent cordon, like in this photo, we're probably just talking about 60 inches. I don't fully expect you to place a cordon kind of line at 36 inches. That's probably too low on it. So these images you previously saw, so yet again, kind of back to our terminology here, these is a decision that you really need to make, and it will impact your trellising and kind of your structure setup too. You know, you've got your main trunk, you've got this cordon in place that's going to live for about 7 to 10 years. And then off of that cordon, you're going to have spurs that have developed. And the spurs are very short canes, which will then produce the fruit every single year. When it comes to actually pruning, I'm not pruning the spurs. I'm just pruning back the growth of some of the shoots that developed that season. When you compare that then to the other corner, the other image here, we have a trunk that is permanent for its entire life. And then every single season, I am choosing canes. So in winter dormancy period, I'm choosing 2 to 4 canes, and I'm deciding on the directions they go based on the structure I have in place. So in this image here, you see I've got new canes that were selected in the winter period. I've pruned everything out. And because I have 2 levels here, I have the ability to do 4 canes going both directions. So yet again, as you can also imagine here too, I need to tie these up and trellis them and make sure they're being tied back here too. So really that might be what you have to consider with already established grapevines, which we'll show some photos of today too. As far as maybe getting, a formal trellising in place, so say you kind of see here with this image, you could do a couple things. You have end posts on your long row, and these should be about 8 to 9 feet long and about 6 inches in diameter. You want to bury them about 2 to 3 feet deep at an angle, and then you also want to brace them much further with a screw and then an anchor or an H brace. A little bit similar to a drawing, which you see here. Down that row, you're going to have line posts, and these need to be about 18 to 21 feet. About every 3 plants is really what you're after here. The image that you see here, those are not actually line posts. Those are the trellising for the individual grapes that would go against them. But the line post would be about every 18 to 21 feet, and then about 2 feet deep with about a 3-inch diameter is what you're after. You could then, of course, do steel fence posts at each plant if need be. You could run a high tensile at, say, 36 inches or 60 inches, depending on what you're after. You might also even consider adding an additional tensile kind of metal higher up that maybe could allow for the grape shoots and the fruit to rest, if so choose. But these designs, the end post and the line post, are pretty common when it comes to a lot of very traditional grape vine structures that you might see out there, kind of trellising systems. This is taken from Texas A&M. So this is actually thinking about more of an arbor. And you can see in this design that the trunk is in place in the middle, and then this is about 8 feet tall. And once the trunk has reached 8 feet tall, they have actually created a cordon. And that cordon is, of course, yet again, our semi-permanent extension that will have spurs off of it. And the spurs will then produce the grapes for you. You see in this system that you've got a number of cordons, or rather a number of spurs that are growing off the cordon at that height. When it comes to pruning it every single season, you would be pruning back to the spurs off of the cordon. So it could work really well for you, depending on kind of what you're thinking of it. You might also see this design and think to yourself, okay, the trunk goes up to 8 feet, and then at that trunk, I could be growing canes off of it. And so you could be selecting canes to grow off of it that would then be producing fruit. And then every winter, you would be removing the canes that had already produced fruit while selecting 2 to 4 canes that would then be that following summer's fruit to develop from it. So that's one kind of adaptation that you could certainly do. But anytime you think about your arbor or your structure, you would be thinking about how far tall you want that trunk to be. And then from there deciding, is it going to be canes or is it going to be a cordon with the spurs? Very similar designs you just previously saw on that other page, kind of, with this kind of trunk in place, and then you've got these different amounts of kind of cordons that are going at certain spacings too. You kind of see that between the cordons, it is about 4 feet is what it looks like to me. And they have 3 permanent cordons running on top of that arbor that you just originally saw. So almost a 3-prong system, if you will, is what I notice with this cordon system. The other drawing that I did for you, you see here, that's kind of an adaptation for an arbor. So it is that you have the trunk is growing all the way up to the top of the arbor. And then once it has reached the arbor, I am utilizing canes that are then growing across that arbor. I would then, of course, want to trellis the canes there, but every single season, I would be potentially choosing 2 to 4 canes that would run across that arbor, from which then fruit would develop. And then every winter, when it comes to pruning them, I would remove the canes that had already produced the fruit, and I would choose new canes that would then stay in place. So there's no permanent cordon in this drawing that I've done for you. It's a continual renewal of canes. And you may find that looks really good, or you may find that it has complicated it, much more than it needs to be. When it comes to pruning needs for both of them on an arbor, it's really going to get back to that structure. For pruning your grapes, this is going to be something where, you're going to be pruning out a lot of canes and a lot of growth. The grapes produced from canes created the previous year. So if it's a cordon design and it's a spur, you will then have shoots develop from those spurs, which will then produce your grapes for the season. You compare that to a cane pruning system in which the canes are producing the fruit every single season, and that's where you're getting that fruit from. Consider this as a very late winter into early spring activity. You could probably go into March pretty well with this. I think if you've had any experience with grape pruning before, you know that about 90% of the growth of that plant is coming out. It's a lot of pruning that is occurring with them. And if you haven't pruned in years on these grapes, you may be looking at quite a lot of time just trying to get some shape for your grapes here. You're going to see 2 common approaches, cane or spur pruning. Cane is the one we're going to talk a lot about today, and recognize fully that this is just an introduction to pruning grapes. This is not going to provide you with as much as you need. In fact, I think this is a topic that we would really benefit greatly with having in person and being at a vineyard, I think. What about which one? Which one might work better for you? Say, could you go from cane to spur pruning and back and forth? Realistically, you probably want to choose one or the other. It's going to take some time if you keep going back and forth. And really, I don't think I would necessarily recommend it at this point to go back and forth. Choose one or the other. It would be my suggestion. One of the things you'll also see, pretty regularly is, just encouraging this. We're always going to encourage you to prune these. And in fact, this is something that you're going to really want to do every single season. But you're going to prune for plant health, for the vigor, for the renewal of the vines. That's what's really going to be really important here for your grapes. This image you see here is cane pruning. So you can see that you have a very clear trunk in place, and there are about 3 different lines here. And so every season you're coming through and you're selecting 2 to 4 canes off of this main trunk that are then going to be trellised for the upcoming season. This is also a pruning method that it's going to allow for good balancing of your fruit load, good light penetration and airflow to address diseases. It can get very complicated, and you'll see guides out there that will tell you to take all the pruning wood and weigh it, and whatever this weighs, that's then how you should prune it. And I'm a little cautious to tell you to start doing that. As you get more comfortable, certainly you might go that route of getting more pruning done, but keep it simple this first couple of years as you grow your grapes. Which pruning method then? I think if you're growing wine grapes, recognize that more commercial operations and wine grapes tend to be more common for spur pruning. That's what you see with spur pruning. So you see in the top photo and the bottom photo that the spurs that have developed is where you're going to be doing your pruning. Those short little canes. And so every season you're coming through and you're pruning out the growth there. And then that season is going to produce grapes from them. So it can be pretty simple to do this. And yet it's going to depend highly on the structure you have in place. This is going to depend on that cordon being created. For cane pruning, small scale arbors, standard trellising, it's going to be much better for table grapes. And it's just going to be much easier, I think, in most cases for you to really do. I think you're going to have more success with cane pruning perhaps than it will be spur pruning. Spur pruning can get a little bit more complicated than kind of what this photo shows. And in fact, I'm sure you all are aware, if you've got grapes that you're growing, this is a lot more has to really, just to find the canes, to find your trunk can take some time even as you start pruning. So let's focus on cane pruning then. So every winter, once you get into say year 4 realistically, you're going to have 2 to 4 canes per plant are selected from that main trunk. And then they're going to be bent into a shape on the trellising that you have provided. And you're probably going to find that you're going to have to tie them up. From each cane, you want a number of buds. And so that's how you're going to then determine how far to cut back your cane. So typically for wine, you see about 20 to 30 buds per plant. For table, this is about 50 to 80 buds per shoot. So table grapes, you'll have a lot more canes. That's realistically why we sometimes might encourage spur pruning for wine grapes, is that you may just have one line where that's where the wine grapes are going to be produced from. Because you can see typically 20 to 30 buds per plant is what we're realistically after. You also would leave renewal spurs, which will show you again what that looks like, but all other growth is removed. The other thing to mention is that as you start pruning, you're going to find so many cane options, and yet you want to look for those that have a cinnamon brown in color. You'll find that they also are just slightly larger in a pencil diameter, and then look towards a cane that's about 3 to 5 feet. So try not to have a cane that is 9, 10 feet long. You really want a cane that's about 3 to 5 feet. And then from there, you would prune that cane back to a certain number of buds. About 15 per bud might be where I'm after. So you can see in this image, in this drawing, you've got a lot of cane choices, and yet we're just going to remove a lot of them and basically go down to about 4 canes. Each cane is tied on a trellis system. So if you had 2 in place, that's what you would do. If you had 1 in place, you would just do 1 in one particular direction. You also may find that with these canes, you may need to tie them up higher against it. Kind of you see where there's 2 canes that are kind of intersecting, and I need to kind of trellis them closer to that main support that it has in place. That's that Iowa State photo that you saw earlier. So you can kind of even see in that drawing, we've got our strong trunk in place. And then either directions, we have those 1-year-old canes that we then are going to tie up once they have been selected. Another thing to mention is that you may have the ability, if you find that there's not any canes on, say, the right side, but they're all on the left side, you can pull them and move them to the right side to even that out. It's a very common approach that folks use, and you would just then be tying it onto its trellis system. For spur pruning then, it's a single double cordon, so you see that extension both directions. We have about 6 to 7 spurs per cordon direction, and these are spaced about a fist distance. So think about your fist and how big it is. Typically, that's what you want your spurs to be between. And then you're going to be cutting back canes from the spurs to about 1 to 2 buds. So you see in this drawing here where the red dashes are, I've come in here, and where my spurs are at, I'm just cutting back those canes. This can be, of course, pretty quicker, very efficient once the cordon has been established for a number of years, but you're going to need to replace it every 7 to 10 years. I think that's one of the main drawbacks with this system, with it. But if you think about efficiency, if you think about productivity, this might be an option depending on what your trellis system looks like. So one of our, I don't think he's on today's call, but he sent me some photos of some of his grapevines, and I decided to kind of color these. So you've seen some of my other drawings before where I'll kind of color some of the growth. And as you look at this one, you can see he's got basically 2 lines of trellis in the gray. And then to me, it looks like he's got some established cordons, and yet the cordons are kind of going in a couple of different directions. I think one of the main decisions he would have to make is to kind of do a heading cut there in the red. And then what he also wants to look at is to see if those 2 cordons, those thicker wood on the right side, if they have any spurs on them. Because to me, it looks like he doesn't have spurs on those cordons. Because if he doesn't have spurs and you're looking, you want to make sure you've got some spurs there, it's going to mean that it's probably not worth saving those cordons. And what he could do is remove both of those cordons on the right and shift this over to a cane system and look for canes on the right side, on the left side, and then train them basically. So you might be able to do this. This might be a great place for you to start, is in fact, if you found that there's these cordons, but they're not producing for you, is to trim things back and actually move it over to a cane system. That would be an easy kind of step that you could do. Otherwise, he might be able to keep those 2 on the right, pull them down, trellis them onto that hard trellis system he has in place. And then on the left side, look to see if he has some canes that could be created into cordons over time. This is one of the other ones. Yet again, this looks like a cordon system to me. So he's kind of coming through where maybe some of those spurs are, and he's just going to cut them back to where the spurs are selected. Everything else is removed. If he was thinking to himself that he wants to make this just a cane system, then he would prune both of those cordons all the way back to the trunk, but leave behind any canes, which then could be selected to take over that line. You then would want to think about how many buds are on those canes and prune them back to it. So what this means is that you could, depending on how far along some of your grape plants are, you could shift it to a cane system or a cording system, but don't fully expect to go from year 1 or year 3 as canes and then year 4 or year 5 as cordon. You have to do one or the other. Very similar to the other ones you just saw, you've got 1 line of trellising, you've got what looks to be a cordon on the right here. On the left, he has the potential to utilize that cane and create it into a cordon system to balance out the others. Or yet again, he might look at this cordon on the right and not see any spurs, not see any places where fruit is going to develop, and instead remove that cordon and create it into a cane system on both sides, or decide to have a replacement for that cordon. It can be really kind of up to him at this point. So I hope those kind of helped you maybe understand a little bit about what to think about here. And those 3 examples of those photos also, we see a lot of times just canes all over the place. So I recognize it's kind of easy to look at, when there's not a lot of growth. Anything else as far as pruning goes, you might do additional pruning. This would be spring, summer. A lot of times this is removal of some of that season's growth in most cases. This is going to help for airflow, fruit quality, disease management. It helps bring in sunlight, which is what sometimes this fruit really needs. It can get very technical. And if you're thinking of doing any pruning in the spring and summer of that summer's growth, you want to look at probably shoot thinning. Shoot thinning would be your best option here. There's additional fruit thinning that you can do and fruit removal to balance it, but it can get a little more complicated. And I think you're going to be better off if you decide to do this, to do some shoot thinning. So what that means is you would come in where you see these shoots that have developed, and you would remove some of those extra shoots per bud. Typically you just want about 1 fruit shoot per bud. And you see a photo of what this looks like where there's some actual fruit that has developed from it. You do want to wait until it's about 6 inches in length before removing. And this would be more recommended for wine grapes on a cordon. So every spur, you would find that there might be some additional fruit developing from that spur, and you would actually come through and you would actually remove one of those fruit shoots. There's other ones out there, but just certainly know that this one might be the easiest one for you to do to kind of balance out it. You might certainly even see some of your fruit canes that have a lot more, and this would help kind of open it up some. So our second part is going to be along disease management. Just want to mention that, this Midwestern disease area is thriving. We have wet, cool, humid conditions that allows for this to happen. You should expect disease and sometimes expect more than one disease. It's very common for you to get hit hard with one disease and then it moves into another disease and finally another disease. It's also important to recognize your fruit expectations. Going in knowing if that cultivar has disease resistance can be something that will help you realize what you need to do or what you can't do. And also recognize fully where the fruit might need to be going. If you're wanting to sell to someone, their fruit expectations can be much different than yours. There are fungicides available. There's very few organic choices. If it's arbor and you have a trellising system in place, that's going to be very hard to control disease. Just kind of recognize that. So some of the practices, we've mentioned disease resistance already, look for areas that have good airflow, try to have good pruning practices and trellising in place. So this could be that, yes, you are doing pruning in the wintertime, you're cleaning up any debris that has overwintered in that area too. You also want to think about where your grapes are located. Any nearby wild abandoned grapevines can sometimes harbor disease, and that disease can move in really quickly to some of your fruit. Look towards fruit thinning as well if you're wanting to control more of the disease and allow for good airflow to really help manage disease further. That would be one recommendation, is to learn how to do that properly to really help with this. Note there's fungicides. Some have to be applied before disease is even present. Some have to be applied before initial symptoms are present. And a lot of them are just for one particular disease, but they need to be applied frequently. They may need to be applied every week, every 10 days, every 2 weeks. Some of the most common ones are copper, sulfur, mancozobe. Copper and sulfur are organic. Just recognize that some disease, or rather some cultivars of grapes are sensitive to copper and sulfur. So these grapes can be very sensitive to copper and sulfur, if you will, with it. Sorry about my audio. I just recognize it's going in and out here. So I apologize at the timing thing with it. I'm trying to repeat things as it keeps popping up. So I apologize about this. For black rot, considered the big disease, can result in crop failure. No disease resistance. Typically, we see this about May through July. Infected berries are the first to appear light brown. Eventually, they shrivel up and become hard. You see it on the photos here. Just really rough looking disease with this is the black rot. One thing you could do is remove the mummies and your infected canes from previous season. And you note here in that back photo of what that looks like. This is one where fungicide 3 to 4 weeks after bloom would be crucial for this disease to really manage. Powdery mildew, you may have seen this on some of your other plants, other cucurbits. It's all season long. It can overwinter from previous leaves. It's a white powdery layer on leaves or fruit. It's also something where the leaves become distorted, the fruit splits. The one thing to mention is that there are resistant varieties. It's also one to look at getting resistant varieties because you could have powdery mildew all season long, and that's something to be very concerned with. Neem oil is recommended for powdery mildew, and it could be something that you so choose to use. That, of course, is an organic product that a lot of folks really like and utilize. Same with downy mildew. Overwinters on leaves from previous year, severe infection from leaves to the fruit that you have growing. The fruit can also get covered in a powder like sugar, like spores. So you may notice that for some of that. They also thrive in very warm, kind of wet weather with severe damage into August and September. We see that pretty common. Botrytis bunch rot in gray mold is one that's really rough looking. And you can see that not only will it impact the fruit that has already developed, it also is impacting the fruit that is beginning to develop. It is a mid-season one. You may see it's in June or July. It also tends to grow on dying and dead plant material before moving to living material. This would be one that maybe you might be able to help control by removing any dead material off of your grape plants early, early during the dormancy period in dormant pruning. Um, but before ripening, this is one where it's going to move from grapes to grapes. And just there's also one to try to minimize injury to grapes. One of the strategies that you could do is to put some bird netting in place, as that could help address bird damage, which could then have led to, say, Botrytis bunch rot or kind of the gray mold that you see here. But certainly this is a really nasty, rough looking disease. And we fully kind of don't expect this to be, you to be consuming or eating this either. It's not going to affect you, but just know that it's just not going to be good tasting. Anthracnose, another one, all parts of the plant. It's very common on these shoots and berries that may have developed. So this is something where maybe during your dormancy, or rather during the summer, look to prune, some of the shoots. Shoot removal might work really well here. You'll see noticeable kind of red circular spots on the fruit. But certainly this is one that, unfortunately, the fungicides are not effective. And other diseases you've seen, when that shows up and you're dealing with it, in most cases, it's too late to have applied a fungicide. Once the symptom is there, the symptom is there. For sour rot, rapid rotting of the ripening grape. You see it here where it's just starting to decline much later in season, of course, just as the grapes began. You'll notice a bit of a vinegar-like smell to it. It is also sometimes combined with damage that the grape plant has already exhibited. So perhaps it is from bird, from hail damage that has really made the grapes very vulnerable to this. This would be one reason to utilize a bird netting, is to allow for the fruit to not be damaged further, which then could lead to some fungicidal, which then could lead to more disease problems. So those are just some diseases to look out for. Yet again, fully expect a season of disease for most of these cultivars that may have some resistance or a little perhaps. I'll mention just Japanese beetles briefly because we do know that they can be highly destructive on your grape plants. Depending on how many plants you are growing, you might consider using, say, a row cover, a piece of cloth material that could create a barrier from the grape plants itself. Traps can sometimes work, but we usually find they attract more than have ever been captured. Trap cropping is also one that could work perhaps. However, you may find it just doesn't work as well for them. There are chemical control options with neem oil, which, if we think of neem oil, that could be we think about neem oil that could be addressing your mildew, could also be addressing your Japanese beetles at this point too. There's also soil solutions, although we usually don't recommend the soil solutions. Folks have had success with a handheld vacuum and drowning it as well, drowning them too. If you're planting any new grapes this season, look towards grow tubes, and that's what you see here in this photo. A grow tube is going to protect the plant from any deer that early season, and so that would be highly recommended. And as you also think about your grape that season, it's going to really allow for it to begin to develop that trunk shape that you're really after. The soap deterrents mentioned previously could also work here, like Irish Spring. Try to keep the area around the tree, or rather around the grape, weed-free. No mulch is beneficial here too. You may find a hot pepper spray works, although this is something where it's going to wash off. And then finally, maybe a micro enclosure, 16 by 16 feet. Yet again, may not work for the grape area that you have in mind of keeping them out. For birds, look to site selection away from trees, but netting is going to be your friend. It can be expensive. We certainly recognize that netting is very expensive for grapes, and yet especially for this crop, this is one where we might recommend an investment of a netting system. 3 to 4 inches at least is the minimum you're after. Certainly have to recognize that the growth of grapes will go sometimes beyond the netting and with it. But if you're thinking long-term of grapes and their health, this would be one to consider that could help with bird control while also maybe helping with disease issues that you might have. There's always different ones out there like scare devices, chemical repellents, and so forth, but you may find they become very tolerant to a lot of the actions that you have in place or actions that you're maybe thinking of doing here with it as well. There is a chemical repellent, grape Kool-Aid, that some folks have had good success with. It should be noted this is unsweet grape Kool-Aid. I would say that netting is going to be the one thing that you might consider depending on your scale. So you have survived your grape season, hopefully not much disease issue, hopefully not much insect issue, and yet you've made it to harvest. A lot of them are going to be based on a particular color. So you're looking for a certain color of that cultivar. You may also find with your bunch of grapes that the stem supporting the cluster begins to change from green to brown. That's just one noticeable feature. Some of them, the seeds will be darkened, they'll be more mature, of course. And then if you are going to do kind of a taste test to see if it's ready, start at the end of that cluster and work your way back. That typically is going to be the first place where they begin to ripen. It's going to be that tip of that cluster. As you can imagine, this is going to vary considerably with wine versus table grapes. That's really what you're going to find, is that it's a considerable change between these two. So we're getting wrapped up today. Please feel free to place any additional questions in the chat box I can answer for you. You'll get an email with links to all of these resources that you see here. I've spent some time this week certainly looking for some really good videos that I hope could help you when it comes to the trellising, pruning, and training of the grapes that you currently have in place, or maybe the grapes that you're planning to put in place. And there's 2 great YouTube videos from Oregon State that go into both of those really nicely, which I think you'll really find that helps you out quite a bit here. And then of course, a lot of other home production guides from some of our friends in other Midwestern universities. So as a gift wrapped up today, really think about those cultivars and make sure there's some disease resistance on them. I think that that's really going to help you figure out whether this is going to be a great experience growing grapes and getting started with growing grapes, or whether this is going to be a painful process. We certainly know folks in our extension unit who have grown grapes for successful years, and we know a lot that have not, that have started growing grapes and have pulled them out because the disease issues are notorious. So really think about those cultivars wisely and make sure you include disease resistance here. Consider, of course, your long-term goals. If you're thinking that it's going to be wine grapes, that you're going to retire and get into growing wine grapes, that is admirable, and certainly consider those cultivars there too, and how you have it set up. If you're just growing grapes to add to the backyard fruit production, maybe it's going to look a little bit different though. Consider training, trellising, and pruning your grapes as well. Focus in on that and ensure that they're getting everything that they need. Manage diseases, your insects and your birds, not only that can help with disease, but maybe it can also help any damage that might result on them. And gosh, enjoy your grapes. I think that's what we really want you to do, is to enjoy the grapes, to enjoy kind of this process. So that's my email, that's my phone number. Yet again, you'll get an email today with resources that have been provided. I'll also, once we get these YouTube videos set up, you'll also get a link to those. I'm gonna start my video, apologize about the connectivity issue. I noticed it throughout today, which is not how it usually is. So it may just be a Friday thing, but certainly something we're gonna